Good evening, everyone. My name is Leah Brusak, and I'll be presenting or walking you through our capstone project in which we've evaluated the future availability of clean electricity for SeaTac Airport. So our client is the Seattle-Tacoma Airport. It's overseen by the Port of Seattle and Washington State. It's been a client of Capstone previously and has shown great commitment to sustainability. Their mission is to advance trade, travel, and commerce while acting equitably and environmentally responsibly. And they have the ambition of becoming the greenest and most energy efficient port in North America through their carbon reduction initiatives. And that's where our team comes in. So their interest in this research topic was sparked by recent clean energy transition planning of Washington State and how that affects their strategy, which is driven by these greenhouse gas emission targets. So what they've asked us to do is further investigate their electricity providers and how they can contribute to their greenhouse gas reduction goals in response to some of this planning. So what you see on the left here are the SeaTac greenhouse gas goals, and we're really focusing on that 2040 target to be net zero or better for scope 1 and 2 emissions, because that includes the emissions from purchased electricity. And on the right here for the Washington State, you see from the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or CETA, these greenhouse gas targets, which apply to all Washington utilities. And we see a progression towards that 2045 target to be 100% renewable or non-emitting. So with these targets in mind, our research question is, to what extent can SeaTac rely on its electricity providers to meet its own greenhouse gas emission targets? Now, getting into our research, we first wanted to evaluate the electricity generation in Washington today, and also figure out what we need to consider for longer term supply and demand projections. So first, we see the abundance of hydroelectric in Washington State, and this drives down the cost of electricity, and we also see relatively low emissions from electricity in the state as well. Next, on the demand side, we expect significant increases in electricity demand by 2050, mostly driven by the electrification of the transportation sector and also other end uses in buildings. And finally, related directly to climate change, we see this increased seasonal changes in hydro production. So with that being said, these kind of introduce maybe potential obstacles for these utilities to meet their clean electricity targets. So moving into our regulatory landscape, this reveals yet another obstacle for one of the electricity providers that I'll go further into detail. So first, we see for SeaTac, about 4% of its electricity is coming from 2 Washington utilities. And these Washington utilities, as I said, are regulated by CETA, so they have to meet these greenhouse gas emission targets. However, the majority of SeaTac's electricity is coming from the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA. And BPA is a nonprofit federal power marketing administration. So as a federal organization, they're not regulated by CETA. Instead, they're guided by the Northwest Power Plan. And as you see up here, they also supply electricity to other Washington utilities. So the big question is, what does that mean for SeaTac and also these Washington utilities of how they can meet their 100% clean electricity targets? Now, getting into more detail about BPA, their objective is to provide reliable electricity at the lowest possible price, primarily through marketing existing federal hydropower. So on the right here, we see their electricity mix, mostly hydroelectric, about 11% from nuclear. And then we also see these market purchases. So these market purchases are assumed to be from fossil fuel resources. And this percentage fluctuates over time. Historically, it's ranged from 3 to 12%. And it's mostly driven by variability in stream flow, which affects hydroelectric output. So pulling in those previous findings of significant increases in electricity demand, and then also increased variability even more for hydroelectric generation, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to what the scale and makeup of these market purchases will look like in the future. So given this, and through additional communication directly with BPA, we've come to the conclusion that they won't be able to provide 100% clean electricity to SeaTac by 2040. Now that gets us into our analysis of different actions that SeaTac can potentially take. And when brainstorming the different options, we kept a few things in mind. First, we wanted to keep in mind the timelines in which the state and SeaTac greenhouse targets have. We also needed to consider that SeaTac operates within purchase agreements and contracts for their electricity. Next, we wanted to take into consideration different stakeholder interests, including that of SeaTac, of other state agencies and utilities as well. And we finally wanted to consider a range of different options with different mechanisms to get to 100% because of all these uncertainties within the regional electricity market. So getting to our options, we've developed 5 different options for SeaTac to consider moving forward. First is install on-site solar and battery storage to reduce their demand for purchased electricity. Next is to consider developing a community solar project, which really aligns with their mission to operate equitably and environmentally responsibly in their community. Third is to harness their collective bargaining power with other state agencies who also rely on BPA to meet their greenhouse gas targets. Fourth is to negotiate their contract with BPA to potentially contractually acquire a higher percentage of clean electricity. And finally is to consider a transfer of some of their purchase agreements to the other utilities that they're already customers of that are regulated by CETA. So to hopefully make things a bit more clear, we developed a timeline. So first at the top, you see the CETA targets and also the SeaTac targets as well. And under that, you see the BPA contracts. So the current contract with BPA ends in 2028, and it's typical to enter into negotiations about 3 years prior. So this is really important because the next planned contract with BPA would span 20 years from 2028 to 2048, which is of course past their 2040 target. Now, moving into the options, we see that they can start considering 4 of these different options currently now. So first is to look at on-site solar and battery storage. And we recommend that in the short to medium term, they start evaluating in more detail the feasibility of these projects. So for a little bit of background, they did do a feasibility study of on-site solar in 2017. They also assessed some of potential for off-site solar. And what our team did was a preliminary analysis of the cost and impact of adding battery storage as well. And so from that, we've seen that they do have a low projected return on investment, and the overall assessment for on-site capacity is only about 8% of their total electricity demand. So we still believe that it would be to SeaTac's benefit to fully evaluate their future potential to, in a way, hedge the future uncertainties within the regional electricity market. So for option 2, we're also recommending that SeaTac evaluate in the short to medium term the feasibility of a community solar project. And this would show SeaTac's commitment to support the environmental initiatives and equity within their community. And there also has been recent regulation to expand the financial support of community solar in Washington state. And SeaTac has already shown interest in potentially having a future capstone group look into this option further. So option 3 falls under the short and medium and long term, and we think it's in SeaTac's best interest as a major customer with BPA to work together with other agencies to align their interests and influence over BPA. For example, we recommend that they actively participate in a working group called Public Power. They've already initiated conversations with BPA about the environmental attributes of their electricity mix and the rates that they pay. So for option 4, this aligns with negotiations with BPA's contract, and it goes along well with option 3. So we recommend that SeaTac encourage BPA to offer a tiered rate with environmental attributes for preference customers. SeaTac is a preference customer. And this is actually one of the recommendations that the Public Power Working Group has put together for BPA. And finally, based on how negotiations go with BPA, they can consider transferring some of their purchase agreements to the other 2 utilities that they're a customer of that are under the regulation of CETA. However, we project a significant increase in electricity costs because of the current low rates from BPA. So while we don't necessarily recommend this in the near term, based on how progress is made with BPA, they can still keep this in mind moving forward. So among these options, we recommend that SeaTac prioritize options 3 and 4, and this is because it most closely aligns with their interests to create strong partnerships, and it will allow them to remain a customer of BPA without requiring heavy capital investment. So I'll conclude with 3 points that have really influenced our research, and we also think are important for SeaTac to consider as they weigh their options through 2050. First are the conflicting objectives between the BPA planning and CETA and other greenhouse gas emission targets. Next are the current disincentives that we see from switching from the status quo, for example, from the low cost of electricity in Washington State and the low cost of electricity rates from BPA. And finally, we've seen just a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the electricity sector. So it can make things really difficult for individual entities like CTAC to create a clear, clean energy plan. But we hope with our help through this project, we can help them get one step closer to reaching their targets. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
Can you hear us online in the classroom?
Where's the question? Oh, from Zoom?
Yeah, can you hear us
Oh.
okay?
Yes.
So this isn't a question, but could everyone mute? It appears Lindy Freeman is not on mute and it's a little distracting.
Good question.
Thank you.
Great presentation and great project. I was a little unclear what the final recommendations are and where that gets you. 2020, 2040, 20, where does that get you on the timeline?
No, that's a good question. And I think, you know, as we're going through this project, we're trying to get to concrete recommendations of this is what you should do. But we've seen a lot of uncertainty. And when it comes to especially the contract with BPA, that their next contract wouldn't start until 2028. So there's a lot of time. So we don't want to commit to say you need to build on-site solar because there's too much uncertainty. You know, they have a lot of leeway when it comes to those contract negotiations. And there's a lot of other entities that have similar greenhouse gas targets that are getting their electricity from BPA. So we think that through these two recommendations, through option 3 and 4, they should really prioritize that now to get a better picture of where these entities together collectively can lead BPA and try to come up with a solution that would satisfy everyone while also taking into consideration the cost objectives of BPA's mission.
So you were focused almost exclusively on the electricity component, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The consumption side from CTAC, was that that calculation going into the future, the projections directly from them, or was that something that you guys projected?
The projections, which ones are you?
For, I assume they're expecting increasing in energy consumption
so
at the site.
What
Yeah.
I talked about in the slides was mostly for Washington State. But for CTAC directly, they do have projections of increased electricity demand. And they also have, you know, they're exploring different energy efficiency measures. But what really was concerning to them was what's the electricity mix going to look like? Because they expect that electricity will have a play in this, maybe not as much as some of their other fuels or the, you know, scope 3 emissions is a whole other task to take on too. So when it comes to their overall greenhouse gas emissions, this is, you know, a relatively small portion of that, but they do expect increases. They also have other projects, expansion projects for the airport that they're taking into consideration. So
Right. And also because they're targeting carbon neutrality and net zero,
Mhm.
A move towards electrification of some of their technologies,
Mhm.
HVAC and cooking, all sorts
Yeah,
of
or like
different things,
natural
whether or
gas
not that's
boilers and
exactly.
Yeah, that's
So
definitely something.
is that included in the projection?
Yeah, so they are like moving from, for example, the natural gas boilers to electrification of that. That's definitely something that why they're interested in what's the electricity mix going to look like at their facilities. Yes.
Great, thank you.